First of all, let me start quickly by thanking the organizers for putting this conference together. This is free trade, as it's called, is such a huge part of the global corporate agenda that we really need to be able to come to grips with it. And in our country, at least, free trade issues have become invisible. It's become very difficult to get a widespread discussion about free trade, as it's called, because we keep on being told by those that are supposed to know these things that the debate is over. Free trade is good. We've solved the problem. Let's move on. Let me spend a few minutes talking about whether or not that actually holds water. First of all, we might be a little bit suspicious about that claim when we look at who actually supports free trade agreements. We have an agreement with the US and Mexico called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. And when that was being put into place, the biggest boosters for that agreement were the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, which is the chief people from the 500 biggest corporations in Canada. Now, it is conceivable, of course, that they can all be in favor of something that's also in the interest of the Canadian people, but my experience would lead me to doubt that. And basically, these are the people who've been pushing for the NAFTA. I have here a list of all those people who are now pushing for the Canada-EU free trade, and basically any big corporation that you can imagine is going to be on this list. Those are the people who think that free trade with Europe would be a wonderful thing. And of course, if their claims are right, it would be pretty amazing. And if we simply get free trade with Europe, there will be a $12 billion worth of benefit for Canada each year. And if you don't believe it, you can read their news releases about it. And each one of those $1 billion will create 10,000 jobs in Canada, new jobs. So if my math is anywhere close to accurate, we're going to have 10,000 times 12 is what? 120,000 new jobs, just like that, for having free trade. Which makes me kind of feel sorry for the Europeans right now, because obviously there's a whole bunch of things that they can't buy, that they're just waiting for a free trade deal with Canada so they can immediately leap into Canada and buy all that stuff that they can't get now. Because somehow there's going to be a $12 billion benefit to us. Now maybe you have a real shortage of maple syrup, I'm not sure. You know, maybe that you're just so desperate for our maple syrup that $12 billion is going to go. Look, free trade is a misnomer from the get-go. Free trade is not free trade for us. No consumer benefits from free trade because it ain't free. There's no free product that comes out of it. What it is free from is government interference in corporations. So it is a true phrase when you look at it that way. It's free trade as in, once we have free trade, corporations are free of any interference from government. It ain't free to the rest of us. Free trade deals, in fact, are more about freedom for companies than they are about trade. If you really look at the free trade deals that we've seen negotiated, trade has very little to do with it. We're negotiating a free trade deal with Europe. Most products between Canada and Europe are now sold back and forth with a rate of, on average, 2% tariff. If it was really about free trade, it would be fairly easy to solve that. You just look at where the urgents are in trade and resolve it. Instead, we're looking at a 900 to 1,000 page agreement that's going to cover everything basically except trade, as far as I can tell. And these are corporate constitutions. We had a scholar in Canada who studied these deals and said that the most accurate way to describe them is not as free trade deals, these are international corporate constitutions. The point is to limit the ability of governments to control what corporations do on an international stage. It's not really about trade. Of course, we're told if we say things like that, that makes us protectionist, which is a bad thing to be, you understand. Heaven forbid that we should be protectionists. Most of the people who call people protectionists don't have a clue what they're talking about, actually, because they haven't really looked at what that phrase means. But you don't want to be a protectionist, by gosh. So what we're doing, apparently, is we're defending the rights of rich North American workers when we fight trade deals. Well, we've studied that, actually, because we have a whole bunch of them. We have some practical experience. What happens under trade deals is pretty clear. The North American jobs went, first of all, to the maquiladora zones in Mexico. And the result of that was to lower the wages of Mexican workers. Like, actually lower them. I'm not talking rhetorically, but we studied it. The wages of Mexican workers went down as a result of free trade that they were first involved in. But then those jobs went from Mexico to China. because even in the maquiladora zones, they couldn't compete against lower wage workers from China. But then some of the Chinese unions actually turned into unions, the wages started to creep up, so the jobs went from there to Africa. And from Africa, they'll move on. I mean, there's no winning of the race to the bottom. So if we're protectionist, it's protectionist against the endless search for cheaper jobs and cheaper wages. Trying to say that somehow free trade is going to enrich the workers of the world has just not been proven true anywhere. Let me give you one quick example of how much we can prove that. In the NAFTA agreement, I told you earlier, it was the big companies that were after that agreement. After 20 years, those big companies had increased their revenues by 127%. They did okay. And they decreased their workforce by almost 20%. So 20 years of free trade for those people that have been seeking it meant a huge increase in their profits and a pretty substantial decrease in the number of people working for them. What else has that agreement done? Downward pressure on social programs. We said it would happen. We said the United States has lower social programs than us. If we get into a trade deal, our programs will be forced down. That was, of course, denied, and within 6 months, our unemployment insurance system had been weakened down to closer to their level. When you get into those kind of trade agreements, you can't introduce new social programs because the whole weight of those social programs says that it is for private sector operations, not for public. In North America, if we set up a new pharmacare, for example, a health provision to provide drugs for the population, we would have to compensate all of the people, all of the companies in the US and Mexico who now do that for profit. That tends to be a disincentive to create a new pharmacare program. We'd be paying billions and billions of dollars to companies in those two countries because of their loss of access to our markets. We call it the ratchet effect. Under free trade, you can ratchet one way. You can move towards what they call liberalization, which is privatization. You can always move that way. You can't move back. Our public programs are under threat, even though we were told at first that they wouldn't be. We know that they are because we've studied even our healthcare system, which is one of the most treasured values in Canada. The definition of a Canadian as opposed to an American is that Canadians are unarmed Americans with healthcare. It's a big deal for us. And that public program, healthcare, is under threat now under NAFTA. As we said it would be, there is a company in the United States that's challenging our right to have a public healthcare system, saying that that interferes with their right to make a profit. Under NAFTA, by the way, companies do have the right to go after our government. It isn't state to state, it's investor to state, so that individual private companies can have more right to challenge our government's decisions than we can as Canadian citizens. I can come back to that more if we get a chance to discuss it further. So this is about a race to the bottom for labor costs. It's about weakening government so that corporations have a freer ability to move around. It's about internationally preventing new social programs. It's privatizing the social programs that do exist. And it's such a good deal that we had a whole bunch of free trade for the last 20 years and we almost had an economic collapse. And the response to that is that we need more free trade. Works for me. What the heck. I've made a few references to the NAFTA agreement. The deal that is on the table right now, the Canada-EU trade agreement, is being described by all of the people who are working on it as every single thing that was in NAFTA plus more. Doesn't that just warm the cockles of your heart? So all of the things I just talked about, plus more that they hadn't even thought of when they signed NAFTA, are on the table now in Canada-EU trade agreement. So let me just take a minute, having perhaps, I don't know, been a little blunt about the subject. What do we do about that? Well, there's a simple, easy answer to that, and as soon as I think about it, I'll let everybody know. It's complicated, isn't it? But first of all, we've got to raise the alarm. Those of us that know something about this is an arcane subject, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who don't give a shit, don't really care that much, don't really care that much about this thing called free trade because they think it's something to do with this stuff called trade that isn't their issue, and they don't know what I've just talked about. So we need to raise the alarm. We need to tell people what this thing called free trade is really about, which is about demolishing the right of governments to govern. farm groups to cultural alliances. We were here in July working with some of the European parliamentarians against free trade, and there was a big dairy farmers demonstration. European dairy farmers protesting the existing trade deal. So we went to that demonstration. We think it's important to make those kind of links because they didn't really know what was being talked about in the Canada-EU trade deal. That was interesting, by the way. When you work with other groups, you have to make some cultural adjustments. They thought it would be a really good idea to burn rubber boots at the demonstration, but we were there. Have you ever burned a rubber boot? Jeez, it's smoky. And, I don't know what was on the bottom of those damn things, but that was pretty. So we're there trying to make a speech in the middle of a bonfire, burning rubber boots. The cultural adjustments is a good way to play. Look, we need to be able to work with a whole bunch of groups that aren't groups that we come from. In our country right now, the Canada-EU trade deal would affect state, provincial governments, it would affect city governments. Many of them don't really know what the effect would be. We've got to work with them to try and raise the alarm. We think we've got to do our homework. We don't think that we're going to win this battle on a rhetorical basis. We think that we really have to have people that can dig into the interior of these things and actually label the reality of it and explain what the reality is. We've got to challenge the rhetoric of the politicians. There are a number of politicians that I've actually directly dealt with who will tell me things that are just complete smoke. Not as bad as the rubber boot. Well, it's actually smellier than the rubber boots. It's just pure smoke. They just say, free trade is good. You can tell, look them in the eyes when they say that. They don't have a foggy clue what they're actually talking about. And they've never actually read a trade deal. They don't really know what it is. It's good. And protectionism is bad. They don't really know. I've asked a couple of them what they actually mean by protectionism, and they don't really have an answer. But we know what's good and we know what's bad. We've got to challenge them and dig below the rhetoric. And building out of that, we've got to build alliances with progressive politicians that are actually on our side. I don't know your experience, you're pretty well briefed on the subject, but there's a lot of progressive politicians who don't have the time to dig into the interior of this stuff. And they're looking for help, and they're looking for our advice on how they actually fight this battle. We need to build alliances internationally. One of the things that we did wrong under NAFTA is we forgot to work with the unions in the United States until it was basically all over. And it was late when we got to building those alliances. We had done some work on it. It wasn't that we hadn't tried. But we should have done more so that there was workers in both of the countries fighting a unanimous battle against it. Finally, we've got to talk to our members. We can't assume that they know about this issue or that they're on side. I've got some examples of some creative stuff that we've done. Anybody want to know why the proposed deal is bad? We've got a comic book for them. So we're trying to talk to our members in all kinds of ways. I just hope I've got one final point. I've been very aware. I have my clock right in front of me, and I've already ignored it so far. One final point, though. Can existing trade agreements be fixed? Can the proposals that are on the table be fixed? There is an argument that says, yes, they can if we insert a labor clause and a social clause. I'm not convinced by far that that's anywhere near enough. It seems to me that if you put a single horn in the middle of a unicorn's or in the middle of a warthog's forehead, it doesn't make him a unicorn. He's still pretty damn ugly. He's got a horn on his forehead. I think if you put labor rights in a trade deal, that you haven't done anything else except put labor rights in a bad deal. Does that mean that they can't be fixed? Based on the premise, which is this is about neoliberalism writ internationally very large, they can't actually be fixed. They can be mitigated. And so what our job is to push them back and back and back until they become, again, actual trade deals instead of deals about international corporate constitutions. So I don't think we should be spending too much of our energy on social clauses and labor clauses in the existing proposals. I think we need to tackle much more than that. But I think it can be done. And I think it can be done successfully. And as long as there's groups like this that are prepared to work on it, you know, that slogan that our world is not for sale uses is actually true. A better world is possible. Thanks for listening.